I had a slide before we officially start the podcast recording. I had a slide here that shows a kind of a questionnaire that we ask folks when they register, and essentially it's a question that asks them if they would be willing to try cultured meat. And we've, after several years, kind of refined how we ask the questions, and it was most easiest to just have three categories. One of them would be non-vegan cultured meat, okay. The other would be vegan cultured meat, okay, which means that they are vegan, but they would try cultured meat. And the last is, I'm vegan and I would not try cultured meat, or cultured meat not okay. As you know, we can imagine, 79.3% of those who responded are non-vegan, and cultured meat is okay, so they would be willing to try cultured meat. I don't know if it was censorship or not that we had non-vegan cultured meat not okay, but it's not on our list. But what was really surprising is that vegan cultured meat not okay. So vegans who would not like to try cultured meat or do not want to try cultured meat was actually higher at 11% compared to vegan cultured meat okay. So of those that are in the audience that are plant-based or vegan, most of them, by a small margin, but most of them would not actually try cultured meat, which I think was surprising considering we're at the Cultured Meat Symposium. But we'll share this data and additional insights that we have from our surveys after CMS 24. Now I would like us to get started on the podcast with David Ziskind, and let's give it a round of applause for David. I'll start my official podcast intro by saying thanks for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food podcast. I'm really excited to have David with us here today. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. And, of course, thanks to you and the Cultured Meat Symposium for having me out here.
David, we've actually known each other for quite some time through various roles, and actually usually meet in a different state, at least a different state every time we see each other, maybe a couple times per year. But tell us about your background.
So that's part of the excitement, meeting somewhere different each time, right, Alex? Yeah, so I'm an electrical engineer by background. I actually started my career in the automation and control space. Moved on to project management, primarily within food and beverage. So that's a lot of what I've done is large-scale project management, design build within the food and beverage space. And I don't know, maybe 7 or so years ago, started really seeing what's happening new in the food space, new things that are happening. First we had, the original plant-based products starting to come out. Then we've seen some of the fermented products, precision fermentation, cultivated meat, all these different things. So I've just really, sort of gone through those different iterations and really enjoyed seeing, one of the things I enjoy are the challenges of a scale up, figuring out how to solve a problem. And so I think that's part of what attracted me to this space.
What are some, when we're talking about food and scale up, like what are some of the outputs, and it could be any type of food, but what are some of the outputs in terms of like some sort of measurement? I mean, we hear tonnage a lot, but like what are some of the outputs of like large scale that you've worked on?
So thinking of large scale, I just think of, production, looking at facility sizes that are, 300,000 plus square feet, large scale production facilities that are supplying, a good portion of the United States and global food supply.
So 300,000 square feet for one facility. Okay, so that's like a big Amazon warehouse size.
So Amazon warehouse is probably more like 1 million square feet.
Oh, they're that big.
That's
okay.
Like huge.
So this
huge.
is a third, though. A
But,
third is still very big.
It's still a good size facility for production.
Okay, yeah, and that's a good frame of reference in terms of how big. And of course, it's not just a warehouse; it's a production facility, so that makes sense. Okay, and so I'm excited to dig deeper into how that kind of works with the cultured meat industry and what we've been seeing and what we've been hearing the last couple days. But you are now at a new role. Tell us about Mach Global Advisors. What is it? When did you start it? And what was the thought process behind starting that?
Great questions, Alex. So I started Mach Global Advisors about 4 months ago now, 3-4 months ago now. Really focused on helping companies sustainably solve their manufacturing challenges. So this is a project advisory consultancy for capital projects, and I'm really about reducing risk and helping companies reduce risk and then maximize success on their capital projects. So the genesis for this is, been 20 plus years in engineering, design, construction of these food and other capital projects facilities. And I saw a lot of the similar issues happen, if you will, on capital projects. Saw some, potential misalignment, between an owner and a contractor or an engineering firm, for example. Started seeing some risks. So I started seeing some of these things really from a different light, if you will. So I wanted to start Mach Global Advisors to really have an impact, both personally as well as professionally. How do we really make a difference? And particularly for, any sort of scale-up process or any nascent space, including cultured meat, how do we help learn from some of these issues that have occurred, and how do we reduce risk and maximize the chance of success on these capital projects? Because at the end of the day, and I think this applies for any food production and especially cultured meat, we need to be able to produce it. We need to make something tangible. This is not a technology or an IP play. You can't eat those, right? So we need something. We need to produce it. We need to not only prove it, but there's also a practical aspect of getting it into the food supply. So that's what I see my calling and mission as.
So when companies, and earlier today we heard about actually Upside Foods and how hindsight is 2020, and they kind of dialed back on a large facility that they were building in Chicago. And we also have seen in the news over the last 12 to 18 months, some facilities being built, maybe too costly, and there have been bills that needed to be paid, or maybe they shut down plans. As kind of like a reference point, when do startups really think about the entire kind of growth pipeline? So when should they start thinking about working with someone to build that, I'll even say it, 300,000 square foot facility? Is it after their R&D is in a good spot? Is it right after they incorporate? Is it after they have successful sales? Like, when is a good time to be thinking about that 300K square foot facility?
So I would say it's never too early to start planning. Planning, especially when you're doing things on paper, is relatively inexpensive. You're talking, low single-digit percentages, right, in terms of cost for planning a large-scale facility. So why not start early? Especially when I'm talking to startups. If we think of that lab, pilot, commercial progression. If you're in your lab facility, you should be planning your pilot and even your commercial scale, right? You don't have to go through the detailed engineering drawings. You don't have to have it fully engineered and designed and have construction drawings. But I think to your point on some of these cost and other concerns, it's never too early to start planning. The beauty about this is you can iterate. You can go through these designs as your research changes, as things change. You can make these changes that are really going to have a significant impact in the positive direction, again, by planning ahead of time. There are certain things that you can't control, right? Cost escalations, a global pandemic, things like that. Some of those are a little outside, but you can, even a cost escalation, you can plan for. We know what historically they are. You look at your design, what things are in place. So I'll go back to, it's never too early to start planning.
Yeah, but a 3D model is so cool for the pitch deck if you have like a 3D model of a full-fledged facility.
That's a bonus of this whole process too, right? You got to go through the planning and figure out what this looks like, and then you've got the 3D model that can help you from an investment standpoint. I mean, everyone wins.
So there's been a lot of companies here that are in the 20 to 40 headcount range, right? At that headcount, maybe a lot of them won't even have somebody dedicated to managing the relationship of having this large scale facility. So I'm going to ask you for the 20 to 40 size, like I would say mid-sized startup, and I'm going to also ask you about the startup team of 5. But starting with a 20 to 40 head count, who are you interfacing with to maybe start thinking about this planning and this build out?
Good question. So, from the size standpoint and thinking about it, and one of the things I also think about and talk about with startups is, startups wonder, should they bring someone on full time just to manage this process? Should they try and do their capital project planning in-house? And generally, I think there's a benefit to using outside resources, outside people and firms who have done many projects, maybe not in the cultivated meat space or cultured meat space, right? But who have the experience going on these projects, understand the engineering challenges, design challenges, construction challenges, things like that. So as far as who to interface with, it is important for someone on the, we'll call it the owner side, to have an interface. You don't just want to turn an outside firm loose and say, come back to me in X months with a design.
And owner would be like the cultured meat company.
The startup, right? The company. That's right. So we need someone to interface with them, help drive some of the design. Now that can be a little challenging, especially if you're still doing R&D, still trying to figure out, still trying to scale up. So I think one of the things by selecting the right engineering partner, design partner to work with, is they can help you through that process. One of the tools that's commonly used is a design basis. So everyone can agree, these are like the ground rules for the facility. How big is it going to be? What are we trying to do? Yes, we might still be figuring some things out, but let's align. We talk a lot about stakeholder alignment. Get everyone aligned to what we're trying to do. Make sure your investors are on board. Make sure you're on board from a company standpoint, and make sure your engineering and design partner agrees that that's something they can work towards.
So at maybe 40 or so headcount, do you think there should be a full-time design and contract engineering person there, or would it be better to have like an advisor role there at that headcount? Do you need somebody full-time?
I think at that size, you can successfully go after these projects and execute these projects without having someone full-time.
Okay.
I think it's important to have that dedicated person, though. You do want to establish that one point of contact so you don't have 40 or 50 people directing the engineering firm, right? But it's a matter of bandwidth. So if there's someone there who has, I don't know, call it 10 hours a week to help direct this process with the right outside engineering partner, I think that's an opportunity to really have an impact there. When you start getting larger, or as you move into construction, or if you're actually going forward and building a sizable facility, then I think it's helpful and makes sense to have someone on board full-time. But again, unless you're a huge organization who is executing a lot of these projects back to back, I think there's a spot for using external firms and consultants to help drive that, to serve as that owner's representative, owner's advisor, to help push that forward, but not having the commitment of saying, I'm going to have someone full-time on staff to manage capital projects until the end of time.
Right. Okay. And this phrases kind of my question about, what if there was a team of 5? So in that scenario, it seems like it would make sense to have someone as a consultant come in to be that interface for planning and maybe, helping with the pitch deck and planning for the future. And you said 10 hours a week or something like that is like the minimum commitment.
Yeah, so I was just, again, it depends on the size of facility, what stage you're at, right? But, someone internally, you want someone internally to interface with no matter what, because only you as the founder, as the person who's running the startup, really only you know at the end of the day what you really want, and you need to be able to direct that. But some of the other nuances and details, you can potentially bring in someone from the outside to help manage some of that, we'll call it noise.
Okay. So let's say a startup is ready to kind of break ground on like a pilot plant. You're at maybe 100 headcount or something, and you have capital. Maybe we won't say a number of fundraising, but instead, size of headcount of 100. They're ready to break ground. They've been working with an advisor or a consultant to kind of move forward. How does the relationship between the consultant interface with the construction company and other parties involved? And what are some of those other parties involved?
So I'm glad you said parties, because there are multiple parties involved, and again, depending on what you're doing, you've got someone who's effectively serving as your project manager. You probably have some other outside stakeholders, investors who have their opinion, right? So there's a lot of management of that. You potentially have a separate engineering firm or firms. You're looking at either a single contractor or potentially multiple contractors, depending on your strategy, to actually do the build. And they can, of course, provide some very realistic cost information and detail and whatnot.
So it's kind of like building a house. You have the project manager, and then you have somebody to come in to do the foundation, somebody to do the framing, somebody to do the roof. In this scenario, it's all that plus maybe bring in these systems, those systems, and that kind of thing. Okay.
That's right. I mean, you're building just a much larger house, right?
A much larger house, maybe with a very big refrigerator. Okay, and so earlier we had a couple discussion topics of I believe it's greenfield versus brownfield. So this is the idea of taking over an existing facility and retrofitting compared to going and building a facility from scratch. And I think this is very much different than the same analogy of like buying maybe a used house, because if you're doing something very different, you will need a very different type of house. But tell us a little bit about how the process would work if you do take over an existing facility, and if you do have any examples of maybe what kinds of facilities could be appealing to a cultured meat company to overtake or retrofit, that would be great.
Yeah, so just thinking about terminology, when we talk about greenfield, that's something starting from scratch, a greenfield, if you will, building everything up, building the entire structure, everything like that, as opposed to brownfield where some things are in place. That could be anywhere from just an existing shell of a facility to, in some cases, maybe you're able to get your hands on a facility and some equipment or a facility that was previously used for another purpose. So there's not a right or wrong way to do it. Some people think that one way costs more, costs less, and that's not necessarily the case. When you think about a brownfield or a retrofit of an existing facility, one of the challenges you have to pay very close attention to what was its original purpose, how was it designed, what's going on there, age of the facility, especially with cultured meat. You want to look for food in general, any potential sources of contamination. Could there be something, an existing pathogen load, right, behind some walls or something like that you may be inheriting, unintentionally. So these are some of the things to think about. But the planning process, Alex, is really very similar. It's about figuring out the project definition. What do you need to do? What is it going to cost? What do you need to retrofit? What is actually value add? What are some things, maybe finishes and aesthetics that you might want, for example, for office space? What are those wants? What are those needs? And then blend it together.
Yeah, interesting. And on this podcast, we've had a couple different companies talk about how they retrofitted their facilities. One example is Paul Shapiro's Better Meat Co. Their facility is in what used to be, I believe, a bounce house, right? And then we also hear Prolific Machines. Their new facility is in what used to be an old jelly bean candy factory. Would you even call the bounce house a brownfield transition?
Yeah, I would consider that a brownfield, and going into the Better Meat Co. and seeing everything that Paul and team are doing there, it's really fascinating, because I wouldn't have initially thought that it was until he shared that it was a bounce house facility. I would have never thought that, but it just goes to show with some planning. What are you planning on doing? How do you really make it fit for purpose, fit for your purpose, for what you need to do? And again, especially with larger facilities, now maybe you're thinking about, do you have truck traffic coming in and out? Do you have deliveries that are no longer, UPS and FedEx in the front door? Now you're getting some stuff in, by truck, coming in a loading dock, things like that. And then overall, you want to think about flow. So you don't want to, especially if you've got a sanitary boundary, you don't want to be going like from clean, dirty, back and forth. So you want to make sure you have a nice overall flow to the facility.
Yeah, there's actually lots of considerations. I mean, we were even moving some, I think, like biosafety cabinets into a room, and the team that was renting that room had to actually move the door over like 2 feet just to be able to get the biosafety cabinet in there. So that's kind of a very small example of the fact that, there will be a lot of things that you need to think about, a lot of things that you need to plan just to move things to make everything work.
That's right. And one other thing to consider is, especially in some of these facilities that may not have been used for any sort of food production in the past, is what does airflow look like? What does the ventilation system look like? Especially if you've got a high care area where you need positive pressure in. Generally, the general commercial, ventilation systems may not be designed, for your needs. So that's just something else to think about.
So a lot of there's few companies in the space that can plan like a very large scale facility, like the one discussed earlier that was planned to go up in Chicago, or I guess we've also heard about in North Carolina, a Lever Meats facility that is going up or has gone up. But most of the companies in the space, they're at a stage where they're building a pilot plant or they're planning to build a pilot plant. So tell us a little bit about some considerations for a company that might be putting together a pilot plant, either greenfield or brownfield, and these are new terms that I've learned, so I'm gonna flex and use them a little bit. What are some considerations when a startup is moving forward to create a smaller scale pilot plant?
So I think to begin with, it goes back to, I keep using this word plan, right? Planning, what's really going on, because planning, taking that time to really create a well-defined plan, it gives you better cost certainty. You have a better idea of cost. You have a more refined schedule, and you have really reduced risk. You have a better idea of what you're planning on doing, and it's okay. You can iterate through these things. I don't know if you've seen the cost influence curve, but as you're thinking about a project, really your influence at the beginning of a project is highest when your cost is lowest. This is when you're playing around on paper, right? Changing different designs, playing around. And again, this is why I say keep doing this early. Moving things around on paper is really cheap as opposed to moving real things around. So this cost influence curve, the idea is, at the beginning of the project, while you're designing, while you're planning, you've got a high level of influence. You can make a lot of changes. Your cost is relatively low. And then as you go through this project, the curves switch. They invert, right? So then your influence goes down and your cost goes up. And if you can make a change, it's going to be much more costly.
We're going to open it up. We're going to have maybe one or two more questions. Then we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. I wanted to ask you about, I guess, permitting and regulation. Of course, regulation from a FDA, USDA standpoint is a totally separate discussion. But is that ever a huge blocker when you're trying to either build a new facility or maybe retrofit a facility? And is that something you or your team also advises with, is getting city permits and that kind of thing, or is that one of the other parties involved?
So certainly when it comes to permitting, and you'll always find a case to prove me wrong, right? The permitting process, I think if you have a well-defined plan and engineered drawings, is I'll say non-issue. Certainly zoning is something to think about because that will generally take a longer municipal process. But generally, from a planning standpoint, especially engaging an engineering firm and producing complete and consistent drawings is generally one of the least of your worries.
Okay, that's definitely good to know. And I guess this is kind of a curveball question, but if somebody was creating a facility in Florida, they would still be able to probably create it in Florida. They just couldn't sell it in Florida. You don't have to answer that, but I'm just thinking of I think there's some similar laws like that in bourbon for making bourbon. I think you can, bourbon can be made in Bourbon County and maybe a couple other counties, but I think that's a dry county. I'm not sure about the details, but that would be interesting to research and put in the show notes.
So certainly on the bourbon side of things, because I've done some work in that space years ago, those are some very interesting laws, especially for the terminology and where it has to be located, what state or whatnot, to be able to call it by a specific term. But again, whether it's that or whether it's looking at these cultivated meat bans that we're seeing, I think that's one thing to consider. But then I also think we have to look at what. Again, maybe you can build it. Maybe that's a non-issue. And then thinking back to, I think it was something Brian Sylvester shared, and I think it'll be interesting to see as this legislation makes its way through and where it fits on that federal and state side of things. I'm very curious to see, and certainly glad to hear Brian address that the other day.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and I guess, personally, I also think about maintenance for running a facility. I'm sure that's a very huge cost. Is there any metric, like percentage of facility cost, that it can be used, or is it also very dependent on the situation in terms of maintenance versus cost?
So I think there are a few costs, and when we talk about costs, we look at capital costs, and then we look at these operational costs. And certainly there's maintenance, there's spare parts, things like that to think about. But it's all part of putting together your plan. What do you really need? What are those spare parts? What are those materials? And that can fluctuate a little bit and depends to some extent on the equipment.
Okay, great. Okay, so we will open up. We have just a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Either thinking about, what kinds of facilities to. Oh yeah, we got one right here. Go ahead. You stopped me at a good time.
Oh, good. I'm curious. We talked about obviously the scale and importance of planning big facilities, right? But and again, we reflected a lot on this point in time in cultured meat where we may have to juxtaposition and change the way we're going to go to market, right, or partner up. Because cultured meat is biotech essentially, and you're developing these cell lines essentially in bioreactors, and we're struggling a little bit with maybe scale. Is it possible that you could envision a situation where let's say an owner-operator, I'm maintaining dozens of facilities close to markets where I can bypass a lot of the supply chain, and that brings a whole new set of challenges. I don't have to build big facilities, but I have to build lots of them. Because then I can bring my product to market to maybe chefs and partner restaurants, or I think it was Alex or Steve talked about McDonald's potentially, right? So I can build my facility next to their distribution warehouse potentially, or where they're processing the meat. So it cuts out a lot, but it also potentially adds some new challenges, right? So
I still think, regardless, it's still you're doing a project or a series of projects, so you still need some level of planning. And then we think about, especially as you're bringing those together, now this becomes a program. How do you make sure all those projects are coordinated? So to your point, how are you getting the same level of quality and delivering the same across the market? So I think it's just a different order of magnitude as far as cost on the challenge.
We hear the distributed model quite a bit in cultured meat discussions. Have you seen this distributed model work? Other than globally, have you seen this distributed model work on a smaller scale for some sort of food product?
So one of the interesting things I think we've seen, especially in the controlled environment agriculture space, as folks were looking at experimenting with, instead of having your mega greenhouse, your mega vertical farm in one area and then having to ship across the country or, in some cases across the globe as we, currently do with certain agricultural products. I think that's one example where you can have those localized, I don't know if you want to call them hyper-localized, but even by the city. So now instead of shipping cross country, now you have something on the East Coast, or you have something in this one particular area, and that takes a lot out of the supply chain in terms of transportation, spoilage, things like that. So I think maybe there could be a potential parallel there.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, and I think from a brand standpoint, Gotham Greens is one that comes to mind. That's around here, and you could very clearly see the facility, and then you're driving around and you see their products in the different grocery stores. Okay, cool. Well, we are almost at time. I just want to ask you if you have any last insights for our listeners today, and also what is the best way to reach you?
So definitely plan your project. Take time going through the project definition. So I was looking at an industry study in metrics, and I found this one area where it said the best defined projects had facilities that average cost about 15% less, while poorly defined projects had cost 15% more. So that's a 30% swing in cost right there, just from a project definition and design standpoint, planning standpoint. So spend that time planning. It will pay off.
That makes sense. Thank you. And what's the best way to reach you?
So definitely on LinkedIn,
Okay.
as you know, but also machglobaladvisors.com.
Okay, great. And we'll put that link into the show notes. It has been excellent to have you. Thank you for being with us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Alex, and thank you for hosting CMS.
This is your host, Alex, and we'll see you on the next episode. But actually, we're still here because it's live. I just made that easier for editing. Let's give it a round of applause for David. Thank you very much.